The Russians lose another strategic aircraft, which is basically irreplaceable. We'll talk about this in the situation report, about its strategic impact, how it will cause problems in the future for the Russian military. But at the same time, the Russians gain additional positions on the ground. Some of them have been really hard fought for by the Ukrainians in the past. Now they've fallen fairly quickly to the Russians. We'll talk about this as well in the situation report. We'll start off with airstrikes. Of course, the Russians keep striking Ukraine, mostly with drones, but with missiles as well, be it cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. Also confirmed use again by confirmed use of North Korean ballistic missiles by the Russians as well. Ukrainians strike back though. There was a big metallurgic plant being struck by the Ukrainians. Whether or not this will cause delays in the Russian defensive production is a different question though, as they probably will be able to import the necessary materials if the need arises, but we'll have to see how much of that will actually turn out to have an effect. Another strike happened in Lipetsk though. There are recordings of strikes in the background. Ukrainian drones hit targets there as well. So it's not completely one-sided, while the air attacks are obviously still absolutely dominant from the Russian side. Let's go to the developments along the front line. We have some changes north of the Seversky Donetsk here in the region, and there we actually have Ukrainian advances by all we can see. We see Ukrainians here, and you can see that that's a fairly easy recognizable position close to Terny. This is here. It's this piece of land, and the Ukrainians were geolocalized here. So basically in here, and not just there, they were also seen in here. This is that hump on the forest line, so which is here. So here and here were Ukrainians. In both cases, Russians strike them. We see medevac, etc. So it's not a guarantee that the Ukrainians retook their positions, but we see that Ukrainian counterattacks have been at least partially successful and at least temporarily regaining positions that were lost to the Russians in the previous weeks. So this, while we can't decide yet where the finite front line is, at least here locally, the Ukrainians seem to have the initiative for the time being. Further south of the Seversky Donetsk, the front line is also changing. There is a quite significant change in the context here from Ivanivske. The Russians now have finally managed to gain a foothold inside of Ivanivske. They took part of that road here, which is inside of the actual town itself. We have airstrikes being recorded with, or Ukrainian drone strikes with FPV drones here, and this is also captured by the Russians. And basically these tree lines up here were not under Russian control yet either. So as of now, we can confirm that the Russians have gained a foothold in Ivanivske. That's further than the Russians advanced during the Wagner offensive on Bakhmut. Further south at Avdiivka, the situation is still changing. We have Russians still holding the initiative here, and they advance west from Avdiivka. We have confirmed additional positions of the Russians here in the tree lines west of the coke plant. The Russians also claim that they have captured the town of Las Tochine, which here we see a Russian milk blogger posting this. And this is here. By now, it seems that the Russians might be under full control of the town. It's not completely sure. We see a pro-Ukrainian map here saying that basically the 2/3 of the town are fully under Russian control and the last part is contested. So neither side having full control over it and permanent positions in it, which basically means that the Ukrainians are more or less pushed out of the town. You can also see the advances. Again, we're talking about another pro-Ukrainian map here, that the Russians advanced into Siverne. They have now entered the houses here as well. They gained additional positions in this area where they which still were contested or held by the Ukrainians until a couple of days ago. And we have seen there is a video of a Ukrainian M1 Abrams tank firing from Berdichi Berdichy towards Stepove and hitting positions on the western side of the town. So it's likely that Stepove has fallen by now as well. I think it must have been the last situation report. I'm not completely sure. I talked about the situation here. And to my understanding, this is not the second line of defense. That's what I said at that point. We can expect that the Ukrainians took a position in Lastochkine or to stop the Russians from potentially rolling over retreating Ukrainian troops, to basically gain time for the retreating troops from Avdiivka to fortify, to entrench themselves, to reorganize, to basically gain a breath. I didn't expect the Ukrainians to hold that line for much longer. For me, it is for much longer. This was a delaying action. So for me, this is not unexpected. That they either have already lost it or are in the progress of losing it. I expect a more serious defensive line to be here. Berdichi, Semenivka, Orlovka, etc. This way, and either then following the high ground here or moving somewhere down here. This will be inside of the planned parameters. This will be delaying actions if, and that's the if the Ukrainians are able to hold them longer here. This obviously, a delaying action intends to gain time, and the Ukrainians don't seem keen to simply trade territory for time. As time, they need a plan to regain their captured territory. The way of the warfare we see right now is very little more of movement. It's more fighting around positions, so giving them up easily is not really what is advantageous to the Ukrainians. This is why we see so much stalemate, so much fighting about single positions from both sides here. So if the Ukrainians hold that line, then it went all to plan. If they are going to lose that within a couple of days, then either I was completely wrong or the Ukrainian positions at that point are too weakened to withhold Russian attacks at that point, which would then indicate that the Ukrainians should be pushed even further west at that point. As said, as of now, I think this was completely as to be expected. We'll have to see if the Ukrainians hold them here. Only then will we be able to come to the verdict whether or not this was a planned retreat, a planned delaying action, or whether the Russians are now at a point where they increasingly roll up Ukrainian positions. But as said, as of my point of view, no reason to panic as of now. I would expect the front line to basically solidify again for a certain time, roughly around that line here. Further south, we have the developments south of Marinka, and here we have Russian mill blogger Wargonzo confirming that the Ukrainians did a counterattack in Pobieda and recaptured some of the positions. Pobieda is now roughly half under Russian control, but the Ukrainians managed to get back into the town. They did a successful counterattack here, obviously, to relieve the pressure towards Novomikhailivka, where the Russians are inside of the town and intend to do a turning movement to force the Ukrainians to retreat further west. But for that, they need to take Pobieda and push down towards Konstantinivka. So we saw the counterattack there that was at least to some degree successful. Further west, I have no change in the Vuhledar region and none in south of Velika Novosika that I can confirm. What we do have change in the area south of Orlovka, and here at least half of Robotine seems to have fallen inside Russian hands. There is a video of Russian IFVs, BMP-2s, it is, driving around here, and they use that central main road and unload troops in these areas here. So we can expect at least the southern part of Robotine at that point being under Russian control. There are some claims that the Ukrainians have lost Robotine at that point completely already, even though I'm not able to confirm that yet. We've had a geolocalization here where they have been spotted here in the video I just mentioned to you. The Ukrainians not only lost this, but they also lost the past fortifications where they managed to take the fortified line here, the first real fortified line of the Surovikin line. This was their, if we wanted this way, their biggest success in the Ukrainian counterattack in the Ukrainian counteroffensive south of Orlovka. And here the Russians are now fully back in control of that area. So the real front line is somewhat probably around here again. The Russian offensive activity shows visible progress south of Orlovka at that very moment. Further west from Kinki, we also have some news. While the Russians, especially Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, claims that Kinki is recaptured by the Russians, this doesn't seem to be the case. Russian mil bloggers deny it, Ukrainians deny it, but we have a fresh geolocalization here of Ukrainians and Russian soldiers fighting. And as you can see, this is like an arm of the river Kinki. And this is actually, yeah. So the Russians have advanced to that point, so we should expect the front line more or less probably going significantly further west than this. So while Ukraine is very likely still in Kinki and is very likely still fighting for it, what it seems to be clear is that the Russians are actually gaining ground there as well, at least from the pictures that we see at that very moment. If we go to the overall situation, we have more like behind the front line, we have more informations, more news. Here in the Kherson region, another HIMARS strike happened one day after the last one that I mentioned in the last situation report. Again, videos from drones show dozens of victims either no longer moving after the strike or just crawling slowly, indicating that at least they are casualties, if not KIA. The Ukrainians say that they killed roughly 60 Russian soldiers. When I count through the numbers, I'm not sure that's 60, but the number is definitely not far away. And again, inside of HIMARS range, the Russians did training in the open, out in the open, inside of HIMARS range, one day after Ukraine struck a roll call of the Russians in this region here, also causing 65 KIA at that point. And the bigger news is from yesterday. We see here a Russian A-50, a Beria A-50, which is basically Russia's equivalent to the AVAX that is being hit by an air defense missile before it is releasing flares, and probably chaff as well, but then it is getting hit in the air by an air defense missile and coming down. The interesting part is where it was actually shot down, because this wasn't somewhere down here. This was in this region. We have roughly in between Rostov-on-Don and Krasnodar, the plane was shot down, came down, which should be out of range of Ukraine's air defense system. Ukraine is now claiming that they did shoot it down. The GUR, the Ukraine's military intelligence, says they did it together with the Air Force, and they claim they used the S-200 system. S-200 was disabled and phased out of service, I think, in 2003 or 2005. So it's basically 2 decades out of service. We know that Ukraine refurbished some systems, but so far they only used it in a ground-to-ground role. Whether they are able to use it at this distance is far from clear. Now, there is a S-300, S-200 missile with a theoretical range of 300 kilometers, and that would be more or less inside of range from the Ukrainian side. As we see here, 240 kilometers. I am not sure whether they own those missiles, though. I didn't find any information that they own them, and theoretically they could have modified another S-200. They could have taken the Seekers and put it on some other kind of missile, something like this, especially as obviously an A-50 is not an agile plane. So you might somewhat be able to modify a missile that is not really meant for that role by putting a Seeker on it, as the defensive maneuvers from an A-15 are limited. It's simply structurally not able to do the same defensive maneuvers as a fighter plane would be able to. The Russians again say it was the friendly fire. They say the missile was started from Mariupol. If that's true, and I think this is probably one of the more credible cases where the Russians might have actually done it, as said, otherwise it's difficult for the Ukrainians how they were supposed to shoot it down. Some rumors are it could have been F-16. That seems to me out of the question that we already see F-16. If I'm forced to choose, I would say friendly fire is actually more likely here, but I hope I make it clear that I'm far from knowledgeable at that point. I don't have any proof who actually did it. It just by the location, it seems more likely it was friendly fire. Now, this would then open up the next question. How is that possible? Like, what the F? YouTube doesn't like that word too much. So how would that be possible? The Beria is a gigantic plane. It's based on the Ilyushin 76 transport plane. So we talk about an enormous plane with a huge radar cross-section that is flying fairly slowly, much higher than any potential cruise missile. How can an air defense unit think this is a legitimate target? How can they think Ukrainian fighter planes might be flying over Russia proper in this region, hundreds of kilometers behind the front line. But those are questions you can't really answer. There are some rumors. What about electronic warfare? That doesn't seem to be too likely either, because then again, even logic alone would already make sure that the Russian air defense shouldn't shoot them down. And you would expect that you can't be that drunk to still shoot down an own plane over this. But whatever it is, the Ukrainians claim the success, and we can expect them to claim it. Simply to cause confusion on the Russian side. Even if they didn't, they might have done it as well. So while we cannot finally say how it was taken down, we do see on the video that it was actually hit by a missile. But why is it still important? Because in the end, it doesn't really matter whom of both shot it down. Obviously, it would be much more important if Ukraine did, simply for the reason that it would then prove to the Russians that they are in danger much further inland, and thus they would have to fly even further away. Russia supposedly had 12 of those planes at the beginning of the war. It's unclear of how many of them were actually operational. It's quite normal that the number that's on paper is not the actual number. That's basically the case for all nations. And we know that one's radar dome, I think is the word, was damaged with a small drone in Belarusia. This is probably repaired by now, but this would be the second loss. Now, while they still have others, they don't really have fresh production. It would take years for new ones to be produced, and while they were working on a successor with the A100, its testing seems to have stopped as it was reliant, at least according to reports on Western part. Now, with this plane being lost, this means that it will make it easier for Ukraine to do cruise missile strikes, and its F-16s will operate easier, because if the radar plane is operating at 10 kilometers altitude, it has a physical range of over 400 kilometers down to the ground. By the curvature of the Earth, obviously, the higher a radar system is operating, the further it can look. And by 10 kilometers altitude, it can reach a little bit over 400 kilometers to find a target flying close to the ground. This is obviously still ignoring radar capacity, radar cross-section, and things like this, but it means that the Russians have a chance of seeing deep behind the front line what is going on in Ukraine's airspace. At that point, are there bombers coming? That will likely mean another strike with cruise missiles, so they could alert their interceptors, they could alert the air defense units, they could use this to guide air defense missiles, SAM missiles, that are shot from the ground without having radar contact. And obviously at the point where F-16s appear, this would allow them to see them coming in. The fewer of those A-50 they have, the more choices they have to make. Now, they probably still have something like 6 to 8 operational, but this means that by now it'll be hard for them to fly them along the whole front line. Basically everywhere they would have to fly somewhere here, and maybe somewhere here. This is getting increasingly difficult, as obviously the crew needs rest, the plane needs maintenance, and the fewer they have, the bigger the gaps will get, either geographically or in times where simply no A-50 is up in the sky, and thus the warning time to the Russians gain by having something like an AWACS, like their equivalent of an AWACS in the sky, would break down. So while the plane itself does not win Ukraine the war, the fact that they shot it down will make it easier to strike Russian targets in the future. It will put choices in front of the Russians that are unpleasant, because they will have to choose either not to have 24/7 coverage or to leave some areas of the front line unattended, and this is obviously a good thing for Ukraine. At the same time, we have a report from here Tatarigami, who with his Frontelligence Insight Group, they have looked at satellite pictures that the Russians keep using depots quite close to the front line, but on the Russian side of the international border. And as the Western partners might supply Ukraine with weapons with a decent range, from the HIMARS system to ground-launched small diameter bombs to now Storm Shadow and the Scalp missiles. At the same time, they ban them from using them on Russian territory, so Russia can still continue its logistics systems quite close to the front line as long as they stay on the international side of the border. This is obviously an arbitrary limitation by Western partners for Ukraine, as there is no legal enforcement. There's no law banning Ukraine from striking military targets inside of Russia, inside of a war. This is simply a choice by the Western partners to tell Ukraine they are not allowed to use these weapons. We continue with troop generations, and there we have confirmation. Actually, Iran is fairly transparent that they gave Russia ballistic missiles, so they are openly saying, and they say they're going to continue doing though. So because there are no longer sanctions about Iran's ballistic missiles, as they have run out, and obviously with Russia in the Security Council, they are out of the question to be renewed. And this will allow Iran to sell ballistic weapons and without breaking any sanctions. So they're going to keep selling them whoever buys them, and they are expected to continue selling them to Russia, who is paying top dollars to Iran for the delivery of weapons. And as Iran desperately needs the money to prop up its economy, that's a win for both sides, but a problem for Ukraine. The GUR, the Ukrainian Military Intelligence, is saying, and this is the Ukrainian military intelligence, so we need to understand this is an active war participant, and we need to take what it says with a grain of salt. But they are saying the quality of Russian missiles is shrinking, while Russia is currently aiming to produce 130 long-distance precision weapons for February. So basically Iskander caliber and comparable systems. And according to the GUR, Russia is now trying to replace foreign components by local production, but they are worse in quality. This was to be expected. Russia doesn't use foreign components without a reason. Either they are far, far cheaper or they are far better. Otherwise, Russia would use domestic production. And by being forced to change this, either the weapons get more expensive or they lose in quality. Nothing really surprised by this. But the other part that the GUR said was fairly interesting and is a little more doubtful. This is that they are saying North Korea has by now delivered 1.5 million shells. So a lot of shells, but, and now comes the interesting part, they claim that half of those shells are defective. They don't work, half of them, and the rest needs inspections and repairs, basically refurbishment. Now, those are absurdly high numbers, and it would be questionable if the Russians would see so much benefit in this. So I am doubtful somewhat to a certain degree about the truth of this claim by the GUR, but at least it said it, and I think I made it more than clear that we need to see that with some grain of salt. And we have news, according to the media, now Indian citizens have appeared in the Russian armed forces. Now, the article here on a German news outlet says that they are talking about basically 18 individuals. It's barely more than a dozen here, but then again showing Russia's successful attempts, at least to a certain degree, to recruit foreigners for its armed forces. We already know that Belarusians fight there. We know that Serbians fight there. There were soldiers or mercenaries from Sierra Leone, from Somalia in the past. We heard about Nepalis. Afghans were also supposedly fighting for them. Now we have Indians there as well. And in the political sphere, we have something weird. The Congress of Deputies of Transnistria here is getting together on the 28th of February. And this is being understood as a call for an annexation by Russia. There was already a national survey, a referendum, which called for the annexation of Russia. Russia never went through with it, and it's either expected that they'll do another referendum or that they insist on Russia annexing them. This is one day before Putin will hold a televised speech, so it would be in accordance, but at the same time, it seems fairly unlikely. Transnistria's armed forces might be able to hold up against the Moldovans, but not against the Ukrainians. Ukraine has on the west side of Kherson, of the Dnipro, at least 5 brigades that are battle hardened. And Transnistria has, to the eastern side, barely any geographical barriers. And it's basically, as you can see, a long sausage of a country, which you can cut through at various places fairly fast and then wipe out. So should this happen, it would probably be close to suicide unless Russia gives a nuclear threat that is being taken serious by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians could overrun them within maybe not hours, but within days. And that would even free their own forces here at that point, because right now there's still a theoretical threat of the roughly 1,000 to 1,000 Russian soldiers in the area, as well as Transnistria's forces. So whether this is going to happen seems unclear. At least my gut feeling says this is not going to happen. Russia is not going to annex Transnistria, but I guess we'll see on the 29th in the next week whether this how this is going to turn out. Also, a Russian opposition platform is saying by now Russia has started 116 investigations and court cases against oppositions in regards to the war. So by all the charges that we talked about in past situation reports, what is now punishable if you resist the war, 116,000 cases have been opened in Russia according to that. And in troop generation from Ukraine, we have news that Ukraine will start producing the CZ Bren 2, the Czech assault rifle that is considered to be one of the best and is used by Ukraine already, but in the past it was deliveries from the Czech Republic. Now they plan to produce them locally, and as they've signed a license agreement, and I'm going to probably make a video about the gun in like 6 weeks or something on Hoplophile, which is in the description in case you would be interested. And we have an article in Forbes according to which the Ukrainian Air Force now has more Sukhoi 24M than they had at the beginning of the war. The reason for that is fairly simple. Initially, it was said that they have 12 of them. We know that they lost a couple of them, and the number supposedly that they lost is 18. So they already lost 1.5 times as many as they had, and the reason for that is fairly easy. Ukraine inherited a huge pile of them after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The talk is about 200 of them, and they probably found ways to refurbish some of them, put them back into operation, not only to make up for the losses of those 18, but according to Ukraine's Air Force, they now have more than they initially had. Obviously, again, we need to think that it's Ukraine's Air Force, and them claiming they have a lot of them is putting up pressure for the Russians and could be also an information operation. But we do know that despite 18 being shot down, they still operate, they still use Storm Shadows and Scalp, which are used from the Sukhoi 24. So at least to a certain degree, there must be some truth to it. International support, we have news from Denmark. They are sending $228 million in aid package. Among that are 18,000 rounds of 155. We know that Denmark said they're going to hand over all their artillery to Ukraine. Supposedly it wasn't just artillery shells, but also their artillery pieces as well. This wasn't clear initially, but at least there are some claims, and I found some Danish newspapers that also say that, so that actually seems to be the case. And now we know the number of shells they had available. It's a mere 15,000, but I guess 15,000 is better than nothing. Also, the first F-16 from Denmark are going to go to Ukraine in summer, are going to be handed over to Ukraine in summer, and that's more or less when most analysts expect the F-16s to appear in the skies over Ukraine as well. So I would not expect that the shutdown of the Beria A-50 was in connection with the F-16 yet. UK is sending 200 more Brimstone ATGMs, anti-tank guided missiles, and they're going to train additional Ukrainian soldiers. And New Zealand has promised another 15 million in aid as well. That was it already from me for now. If you enjoyed this situation report, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment what do you think about the current situation, or what do you think how the A50 was shot down. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. That's it from me for now. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting it. And as said, that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.